I watched my husband's face light up with that familiar, gentle smile as he placed the small white pill in my palm this morning. "Your medication, sweetheart," he said in that voice he reserves for speaking to children and broken things. "Dr. Martinez says it's essential for your condition." I nodded obediently, just like I had every day for the past 8 months, and pretended to swallow it while he watched with those caring, patient eyes. But today was different. Today, I tucked that pill under my tongue and waited to see what my loving husband would do when he thought I had forgotten everything again. What I witnessed in the next few hours shattered every foundation of trust I thought I had built my life upon. But before I tell you what I discovered about the man I've shared my bed with for 15 years, I need you to understand how I got here. How a successful architect with 2 degrees and a sharp mind became someone who couldn't remember where she put her keys, couldn't recall conversations from the day before, couldn't even trust her own memories. If you're here because something feels wrong in your own life, something you can't quite put your finger on, please hit that subscribe button. This story isn't just about me. It's about recognizing when the people we trust most are the ones systematically destroying us from within. The house where my nightmare began was supposed to be our dream home. Richard and I had spent 2 years designing every detail of our colonial revival in Westchester County. I remember running my fingers along the custom crown molding in our master bedroom, breathing in the smell of fresh paint and new beginnings. That was 3 years ago, when I still trusted my own mind, when my thoughts moved in clear, logical patterns from concept to completion. Richard had always been the steady one in our marriage. While I designed buildings that reached toward the sky, he kept our feet firmly planted on the ground. He managed our finances, handled our insurance, scheduled our doctor appointments. "You focus on creating," he'd say, kissing my forehead. "Let me handle the details." I thought it was romantic. I thought it meant he loved me enough to shoulder life's mundane burdens so I could soar. Our home felt like a sanctuary then. The kitchen still smelled like the lemon oil Richard used on the hardwood every Sunday. I'd watch him methodically cleaning each surface, organizing our spice rack in alphabetical order, labeling containers in his precise handwriting. Everything had its place in Richard's world. Everything, including me. The problem started subtly, the way a foundation crack begins as hairline fissure before it splits the whole structure apart. I'd misplace my reading glasses and find them in the refrigerator. I'd start a load of laundry and discover it still sitting wet in the machine 3 days later, reeking of mildew. I'd wake up exhausted despite sleeping 10 hours, my dreams filled with fog and forgotten conversations. "Maybe you're working too much," Richard would say, bringing me chamomile tea in my favorite mug, the one with the architectural drawings of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. "You've been under so much stress with the Morrison project." He'd rub my shoulders as I sat at my drafting table, and I'd lean into his touch, grateful for his concern. But the mistakes kept coming. I started keeping detailed notes, writing down everything: what I ate for breakfast, which bills I paid, conversations I had with clients. But even my handwriting seemed to betray me. I'd find lists in my notebook that I couldn't remember writing, in script that looked like mine but felt foreign. Words would swim on the page when I tried to read my own notes. The letters would rearrange themselves like they were playing some cruel joke. Richard's response was always the same: unwavering support wrapped in gentle concern. He'd find me crying over invoices I couldn't remember sending and pull me into his arms. "It's okay, sweetheart," he'd whisper into my hair. "We'll figure this out together." He researched symptoms online, printed out articles about early-onset dementia and stress-induced memory loss. He made lists of specialists and scheduled appointments I was too scattered to handle myself. The first doctor was Dr. Hendricks, a neurologist with kind eyes and silver hair who reminded me of my grandfather. Richard sat beside me during the consultation, his hand warm and steady in mine as Dr. Hendricks ran through cognitive tests. I couldn't remember 3 simple words after 5 minutes. I couldn't draw a clock face correctly. I couldn't tell him what year it was without checking my phone. "Mrs. Campbell," Dr. Hendricks said gently, "what I'm seeing here suggests some form of memory impairment. It could be stress-related, it could be hormonal, or it could be something more serious. I'd like to run some tests." The blood work came back normal. The MRI showed nothing unusual. The neuropsychological evaluation was inconclusive. Dr. Hendricks seemed puzzled. "Your symptoms don't fit a typical pattern," he admitted during our follow-up. "But that doesn't mean they're not real. Sometimes the brain responds to trauma or stress in ways we don't fully understand." That's when Richard suggested Dr. Martinez. Dr. Luis Martinez had an office in Manhattan that felt more like a high-end spa than a medical practice. Soft, classical music played in the waiting room. The walls were painted in soothing earth tones. Fresh orchids bloomed on every surface. Richard had found him through extensive research, he said, though he was vague about the details when I asked. Doctor. Martinez was younger than I expected, maybe 45, with perfectly styled hair and teeth too white to be natural. He spoke with a slight accent that I couldn't quite place. His handshake was firm, but his palms were soft, like he'd never done manual labor in his life. Mrs. Campbell, he said after reviewing my file, I specialize in cases like yours. What you're experiencing is more common than you might think, especially in high-achieving women who've suffered significant stress. The good news is, it's treatable. He prescribed what he called a memory stabilizer, small white pills I was to take every morning with breakfast. This medication will help regulate the neurotransmitters that affect memory formation and recall, he explained in that smooth, confident voice. Many of my patients see improvement within weeks. Richard was so relieved. I watched his shoulders drop for the first time in months as Dr. Martinez wrote the prescription. How long will she need to take this? He asked. We'll monitor her progress, Dr. Martinez replied. Some patients need it for a few months. Others require longer treatment. The important thing is consistency. She must take it every single day at the same time for it to be effective. The pills came in an unmarked bottle with a custom label from Dr. Martinez's office. No pharmacy name, no drug company logo, no generic name, just memory stabilizer, and detailed instructions about timing and dosage. Richard kept the bottle on his nightstand and brought me one every morning with a glass of orange juice. For the first few weeks, I felt hopeful. The fog in my brain seemed to lift slightly. I could remember conversations from the day before. I stopped losing my keys. Richard was so attentive, so encouraging. I can see the difference already, he'd say, stroking my cheek. You're coming back to me. But something else was happening too. Something I couldn't quite name at first. My work began to suffer in new ways. I'd sit at my computer for hours, staring at architectural software I'd used for 15 years, feeling like I was looking at hieroglyphics. Simple calculations that should have taken minutes stretched into hours. I'd receive emails from clients and forget to respond, not because I couldn't remember receiving them, but because I couldn't seem to form coherent thoughts about how to answer. The partners at my firm, Wellington and Associates, started asking questions. Margaret Wellington, the founding partner who'd been like a mentor to me for 8 years, called me into her office on a Tuesday morning in October. Sarah, she said, closing the door behind us, I'm concerned. The Morrison project drawings you submitted last week, they're not up to your usual standards. There are basic structural errors, code violations that you would never miss, and you missed the client meeting yesterday entirely. I stared at her, my mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. I had no memory of a client meeting. I'd been home all day yesterday, I thought, working on what? I couldn't remember. I think I need more time, I said finally. Maybe I could take a leave of absence just until I get this medical situation sorted out. Margaret's expression softened. Of course. Take whatever time you need. Your health comes first. Richard was understanding when I told him about the leave of absence. It's probably for the best, he said, pouring me a glass of wine with dinner. You can focus on getting better without the pressure of work deadlines. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'll take care of everything. You just concentrate on taking your medication and resting. That's when the isolation truly began. Without work to structure my days, I found myself floating through our house like a ghost. Richard would leave for his job at the insurance firm early in the morning, returning just before sunset. He'd ask about my day, but I'd struggle to recount how I'd spent the hours between his departure and return. I'd stare at the pages of books without absorbing the words. I'd start cooking elaborate meals and forget about them until the smoke alarm startled me back to awareness. Richard began handling more and more of our daily life. He grocery shopped, paid bills, managed our social calendar. Don't worry about these things, he'd say when I tried to help. You need to focus your energy on healing. Friends stopped calling when Richard told them I wasn't feeling well enough for visitors. My sister Jennifer's weekly phone calls became monthly, then stopped altogether after Richard explained that phone conversations seemed to agitate my condition. The strangest part was how normal everything seemed on the surface. Richard never raised his voice, never showed frustration with my deteriorating state. He brought me flowers on random Tuesdays. He still kissed me goodbye every morning and hello every evening. He told me he loved me multiple times a day, but I began to notice things. small details that felt wrong even through the haze clouding my thoughts. Like how he always watched me swallow my medication, his eyes focused intently on my throat as the pill went down. Like how he'd take my empty glass and rinse it immediately, even though he usually left dishes for later. Like how he'd started locking his office door, something he'd never done in 15 years of marriage. Or how our photo albums had begun to change. Pictures I remembered being there. Photos of me with my college friends. Images from my solo trip to Italy before we met. Shots of me receiving awards at work would simply vanish. When I asked about them, Richard would look puzzled. "I don't remember those photos, sweetheart. Are you sure they were in that album?" He'd flip through the pages with me, pointing out all the pictures that remained. "Look, here's our wedding. Here's the housewarming party. Here's last Christmas. I think maybe you're confusing this album with another one." But I wasn't confused. I knew those photos had been there. I remembered placing them in the acid-free sleeves myself, writing dates on the backs in my careful handwriting. Yet when I went looking for them elsewhere in the house, they were nowhere to be found. Richard would help me search, his face a mask of patient concern. "Maybe they're in storage," he'd suggest. "We can look for them this weekend." The weekends became long stretches of nothing. Richard would work in his office while I wandered the house, feeling like a visitor in my own life. I'd try to read, but words would slip through my mind like water through a sieve. I'd attempt to sketch building designs, but my hands would shake so badly that the lines came out jagged and incomplete. I'd call my sister, but Richard would gently take the phone away after a few minutes. "You're getting agitated," he'd say. "Dr. Martinez says stress can worsen your symptoms." I began to feel like I was disappearing piece by piece, not just my memories, but my sense of self, my confidence, my ability to trust my own perceptions. I'd look in the mirror and see a stranger, hollow-eyed, pale, thinner than I'd ever been in my adult life. My clothes hung loose on my frame. My hair had lost its shine. But when I mentioned this to Richard, he'd tilt his head with that concerned expression. "You look beautiful to me," he'd say. "Maybe a little tired, but that's to be expected. Dr. Martinez says the medication can cause some side effects while your brain adjusts." Dr. Martinez. Our monthly checkups with him became the only regular appointments on my calendar. Richard drove me to each one, sitting in the waiting room while I met privately with the doctor. These sessions followed the same pattern. Martinez would ask how I was feeling, adjust my dosage slightly, and reassure me that my symptoms were improving even when I felt worse than ever. "Recovery isn't linear," he'd explain when I expressed frustration about my persistent fog. "Some patients experience what we call rebound confusion as their brain chemistry rebalances. The important thing is to maintain the medication schedule exactly as prescribed. Missing even one dose could set back your progress significantly. But the more I took those pills, the more detached I felt from my own life. It was like watching everything happen to someone else. Someone who looked like me, lived in my house, slept next to my husband, but wasn't really me. The real me was trapped somewhere deep inside, screaming silently at the woman who couldn't remember simple words, who couldn't follow the plot of a television show, who nodded blankly when Richard spoke about plans we'd apparently made together. That's when I started noticing the other signs, the ones that penetrated even the thick fog surrounding my thoughts. The morning phone calls Richard would take in his office with the door closed. I could hear his voice through the walls, though I couldn't make out words. The tone was different from his business calls, more casual, sometimes punctuated by quiet laughter. When I asked about them, he'd brush off my curiosity. "Just work stuff, sweetheart. Insurance claims can be complicated." The way he'd suddenly appear in whatever room I was in, as if he'd been watching from around a corner. I'd be sitting in the living room, staring out the window at the oak tree in our front yard, and suddenly he'd be there asking if I needed anything. I'd be in the kitchen, opening cupboards in search of something I couldn't remember needing, and he'd materialize beside me with a glass of water and my afternoon vitamin supplements. The locked desk drawers in his office that had never been locked before, the new filing cabinet he'd installed and kept padlocked, the way he'd quickly close his laptop whenever I entered the room, even though he'd never been secretive about his computer use before my illness began. And then there were the conversations I'd catch fragments of, phone calls that ended abruptly when I walked into the room, visits from people who left immediately when they saw me approaching the door. Richard always had explanations. Work colleagues, insurance adjusters, contractors who'd come to the wrong address. But their faces showed a mixture of pity and something else I couldn't identify through my medicated haze. Something that looked almost like guilt. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday in November. I was sitting in the kitchen trying to remember what day it was when I heard Richard's voice drifting from his office down the hall. The door was slightly ajar, something that never happened during his private calls. "Probably another 6 months," he was saying. "Dr. Martinez thinks we can increase the dosage if needed. No, she doesn't suspect anything. The medication keeps her too confused to put pieces together. Yes, everything's documented for the insurance." What? Of course I feel bad about it, but you have to understand, this is the only way. I couldn't make out the voice on the other end, but Richard's responses sent ice water through my veins. "The house will be sold by spring if everything goes according to plan. Her sister has already stopped calling. No one questions it because they've all seen how bad her memory has gotten. Look, I know this seems harsh, but Sarah's never going to get better. At least this way, everyone gets something out of a terrible situation." I sat frozen in my kitchen chair, my hands shaking as his words penetrated the pharmaceutical fog that had clouded my mind for months. The pill I was supposed to take that morning sat untouched on the counter next to my orange juice. For the first time in 8 months, I made a conscious decision to skip my medication. The rest of that day passed in a strange, heightened state of awareness. Colors seemed brighter, sounds were sharper. My thoughts, while still sluggish, began to connect in ways they hadn't for months. I watched Richard that evening with new eyes, noting how he monitored my movements, how he ensured I took my evening vitamin, how he seemed almost disappointed when I appeared more alert than usual. That night, lying beside my husband in the darkness, I made a plan. Tomorrow, I would pretend to take my morning pill while secretly keeping it under my tongue. I would see what happened when Richard thought I had forgotten everything, just like every other day for the past 8 months. I needed to know what my loving, devoted husband was hiding behind his patient smile and gentle concern. I had no idea that what I was about to discover would reveal a betrayal so calculating, so elaborate, that it would make me question everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the person I'd built my life around. If you're still with me, if you recognize the feeling of being trapped in your own life while everyone around you insists everything is normal, please subscribe. This story gets much darker before it gets better, and you need to see how deep this deception goes. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with frost covering our bedroom windows in delicate patterns that reminded me of the sketches I used to make before my hands started shaking. Richard woke at his usual 6:30, kissing my forehead gently before heading to the shower. I lay still, listening to the water run, preparing myself for what I was about to do. When he emerged, hair perfectly combed and already dressed in his navy suit, he brought me the familiar white pill and a glass of orange juice. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "How are you feeling today?" "Tired," I mumbled, which was always a safe answer. "Confused." "I know, sweetheart, but Dr. Martinez says consistency is key. Let's get this medicine in you, and then maybe you'll feel clearer after breakfast." I took the pill and the glass, made a show of washing it down while actually tucking the bitter tablet under my tongue. Richard watched my throat carefully, as he always did, then smiled with satisfaction when I opened my mouth to show it was empty. "There's my good girl," he said, a phrase that would have made me cringe before my brain became too foggy to process how condescending it sounded. "I'll make you some scrambled eggs before I leave for work." The moment he disappeared downstairs, I spat the pill into my hand and stared at it. It was unmarked, chalky white, smaller than an aspirin but heavier somehow. I wrapped it in a tissue and hid it in my jewelry box, then rinsed my mouth to get rid of the acrid taste. For the first hour, nothing felt different. Richard made breakfast, chattering about his meetings for the day, reminding me to rest and take my afternoon vitamins. He kissed me goodbye at the front door, looking into my eyes with what I'd always interpreted as love, but now wondered if it might be something else entirely. "I'll be home by 6, he said. "Dr. Martinez's office might call to confirm your appointment next week. Just tell them yes to whatever day they suggest, okay?" I nodded obediently, and he smiled, that warm, caring smile that had never failed to make me feel safe before this moment. An hour after his car disappeared down our tree-lined street, I felt the first stirrings of clarity. It was subtle at first, like someone slowly turning up the brightness on a dimmer switch. The fog that had become my constant companion began to thin. My thoughts, which usually moved like syrup through my brain, started to flow more freely. By 10 o'clock, I felt more like myself than I had in months. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I could remember things, conversations from the day before, what I'd eaten for dinner, the plot of the book I'd been trying to read for 3 weeks. The world around me snapped into focus with an intensity that made me dizzy. That's when I noticed the camera. I was walking past Richard's office when something caught my eye. A tiny red light blinking near the ceiling, partially hidden behind the curtain valance. I blinked hard. Sure, I was imagining things, but the light was definitely there. My newly clear mind began processing what this meant, and the implications made my stomach drop. I searched the house methodically, looking for things I'd never thought to notice before. In the living room, I found another small device tucked behind a picture frame. In the kitchen, one was mounted inside a decorative birdhouse Richard had bought me for my birthday. Our bedroom had two, one in the overhead light fixture, another hidden in the artificial plant on my dresser. My husband was watching me, recording me, documenting my deterioration for, what? Insurance purposes? To prove my incompetence? The conversation I'd overheard yesterday began to make horrifying sense. But if the cameras were the appetizer of my discovery, what I found in Richard's office was the main course of betrayal. The locked filing cabinet that I'd never paid attention to before became my first target. With my mind finally functioning clearly, I remembered that Richard kept a spare key to everything in the junk drawer of his desk, a habit left over from his obsessive need to have backup plans for every situation. The key fit perfectly, and the cabinet drawers opened to reveal files that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The first folder was labeled Sarah, Medical Documentation. Inside were copies of every report from Dr. Hendricks, detailed notes from my sessions with Dr. Martinez, and dozens of photos of me taken without my knowledge. Pictures of me staring blankly at walls, struggling to remember simple words, looking confused and disheveled in my own kitchen. The photos were date-stamped and organized chronologically, creating a visual timeline of my mental decline. But worse than the photos were the handwritten notes in Richard's precise writing. Day 23. Dosage increased to 2 mg. Sarah couldn't remember conversation about dinner plans from previous evening. Confusion lasted approximately 4 hours after morning dose. Day 67. Excellent progress. Sarah attempted to balance checkbook but gave up after 10 minutes. Crying episode lasted 15 minutes. Increased afternoon vitamin to enhance emotional instability. Day 134. Perfect results. Sarah couldn't remember sister's phone call from same morning. Memory gaps now lasting 8 to 12 hours consistently. Dr. Martinez recommends maintaining current dosage. Day 201. Sarah questioned disappearance of photos from college, showed appropriate confusion when I denied photos ever existed, gaslighting techniques proving highly effective alongside pharmaceutical intervention. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the papers, but I forced myself to keep reading. There were pages and pages of notes, documenting my deterioration with the clinical detachment of a scientist studying a lab rat. Every moment of confusion, every memory gap, every tear I'd shed thinking I was losing my mind, he'd been orchestrating it all. The second folder was even worse. It was labeled Financial Planning, Post-Divorce Settlement. Inside were documents that revealed the true scope of Richard's planning. My husband, the man who held me when I cried about forgetting simple words, who made me tea when I felt lost and confused, had been systematically destroying my mind as part of an elaborate scheme to steal everything I'd worked for. There were property assessments for our house, worth $2, $8 million, valuations of my architectural firm partnership, estimated at $400,000, and detailed analyses of my retirement accounts and investments, totaling just over $1.6 million. But what made my vision blur with rage were the legal documents at the bottom of the pile. A petition for divorce on grounds of mental incapacity, already prepared and waiting for Richard's signature. A power of attorney document that would give him complete control over my assets. Medical affidavits from Dr. Martinez stating that I was incompetent to make decisions about my own care, my own finances, my own life. The plan was breathtaking in its cruelty. Richard had been slowly poisoning me with whatever was in those pills, documenting my decline, isolating me from friends and family, and preparing to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could take everything I'd built. The cameras were recording evidence of my confusion and disorientation. Dr. Martinez wasn't helping me. He was helping Richard destroy me. But the final folder contained the detail that nearly broke me completely. It was labeled Jennifer, Correspondence and Documentation. My sister who'd stopped calling, who I thought had abandoned me when I needed her most. The folder contained printouts of emails, and as I read them, I felt the last foundation of my world crumble away. Email from Jennifer to Richard dated 3 weeks ago. I've tried calling Sarah 15 times in the past month. She either doesn't answer or sounds so confused that our conversations don't make sense. Richard, I'm worried she's gotten worse. Can we please look into getting her into a specialized facility? I know she wouldn't want to be a burden on you. Richard's response, Jennifer, I understand your concern, but Sarah has good days and bad days. Her doctors are optimizing her medication, and she's actually doing better at home with consistent routines. Institutional care would only traumatize her further. Trust me, I'm with her every day. I see the progress that might not be apparent during brief phone calls. Another email from Jennifer. Richard, I drove to your house yesterday, but you said Sarah was sleeping and couldn't be disturbed. It was 2 p.m. When I asked to wait until she woke up, you said her doctors had prescribed afternoon sedatives, and she wouldn't be lucid for several hours. This doesn't sound right. I want to speak to her doctors directly. Richard's reply was a masterpiece of manipulation. Jennifer, I appreciate your concern, but your insistence on interfering with Sarah's medical care is actually harmful to her recovery. Her doctors have specifically advised limiting visitors during this critical phase of her treatment. Your unexpected visits agitate her for days afterward. If you truly want what's best for Sarah, please respect the boundaries we've established for her health. The emails went on for months, showing how Richard had systematically convinced my sister that I was too sick to see visitors, too confused to make phone calls, too fragile for normal human contact. He'd made her feel guilty for wanting to help me. He'd turned her love and concern into weapons against both of us. But the most devastating discovery was at the bottom of the pile. A report from a private investigator that Richard had hired to investigate Jennifer's mental stability and suitability as a potential guardian. The report detailed my sister's work schedule, her finances, her social life, all compiled to build a case that she was unfit to make decisions about my care if anyone ever challenged Richard's control. I sat in that office, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy so elaborate it took my breath away, and realized that every person I'd trusted to help me, my husband, my doctor, even my own perception of my sister's abandonment, had been part of a carefully constructed lie. Richard hadn't just been stealing my money, he'd been stealing my sanity, my relationships, my identity. He'd taken the woman who designed buildings that scraped the sky and turned her into a confused, helpless shell who couldn't remember where she put her keys. And he'd done it all while maintaining the perfect facade of a devoted husband caring for his sick wife. You need to subscribe to see what happens next, because what I'm about to tell you about Richard's plan will shock you to your core. But first, I need you to understand that this level of psychological manipulation is happening to more people than you might think. The crushing weight of this discovery left me gasping for air in that office chair, surrounded by the evidence of my own systematic destruction. But anger, I discovered, can be a remarkably clarifying emotion. As the truth settled into my bones, rage began to replace shock. And with rage came something I hadn't felt in months, the clear, sharp focus of my old self. I had maybe 6 hours before Richard came home. 6 hours to figure out what he was really giving me. 6 hours to document everything. And 6 hours to decide how to save myself from a plot so elaborate it would have been impressive if it wasn't so evil. First, I photographed everything. Every document, every note, every email. My phone, which I'd barely been able to use for months, suddenly felt familiar in my hands as my restored mental clarity guided me through settings and apps I'd forgotten existed. I uploaded everything to a cloud storage account that Richard didn't know about, a backup system I'd set up years ago for work files and forgotten about until this moment. Then I called my sister. Sarah? Jennifer's voice was cautious when she answered. How are you feeling today? Jennifer? I said, and I could hear the difference in my own voice. Clear, steady, angry. I need you to listen to me carefully. I haven't been sick. Richard has been poisoning me. Silence on the other end of the line, then, Sarah, honey, you sound different. Are you okay? I'm more okay than I've been in 8 months, I said. Jen, I need you to call the police. I need you to come over here right now. And I need you to trust me when I tell you that everything Richard has told you about my condition has been a lie. It took 20 minutes to convince her. 20 minutes of explaining details that only the real Sarah would know. 20 minutes of describing the contents of emails she'd sent that Richard had claimed I was too sick to read. When she finally believed me, her voice filled with a fury that matched my own. "That bastard," she whispered. "Sarah, I've been so worried. I thought I was losing you to some terrible disease. I've been researching care facilities, talking to lawyers about guardianship options. Oh God, I almost played right into his hands. But you didn't," I said. "And now we're going to stop him." Jennifer arrived within the hour, and seeing her face, really seeing it clearly for the first time in months, almost broke me. She looked exhausted, older than her 38 years, with worry lines etched around her eyes. But when she looked at me, really looked at me, her expression changed to amazement. "You're back," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're really back. I know what you thought," I said, hugging her tightly. "Richard made sure you thought it, but I'm going to need your help to prove what he's been doing to me." We spent the next 3 hours planning. Jennifer, who worked as a paralegal, knew exactly what kind of evidence we'd need to build a case. She called a lawyer friend who specialized in elder abuse cases, even though I was only 42, because the manipulation tactics were similar. She contacted a doctor who could test whatever was in those white pills. Most importantly, she helped me prepare for Richard's return. "We need him to confess," she said. "The documents are good, but if he claims they're research for a novel he's writing or medical information he was gathering to help you, a jury might believe him. We need him to admit what he's been doing." The plan was simple but terrifying. I would pretend to be in my usual medicated fog when Richard came home. I would act confused and compliant while Jennifer hid in the guest bedroom with her phone recording everything. Then I would ask Richard questions designed to get him to reveal his true intentions. At 5:47 p.m., I heard Richard's car in the driveway. Jennifer squeezed my hand once and disappeared upstairs. I quickly took my position on the living room couch, assuming the blank, slightly lost expression that had become my default state over the past 8 months. "Sweetheart, I'm home," Richard called from the front door. I could hear the smile in his voice, the same warm, loving tone he'd used throughout our marriage. A few months ago, that voice would have made me feel safe and cared for. Now it made my skin crawl. "In here," I called back, making my voice sound tired and confused. He appeared in the living room doorway with a bouquet of yellow roses, my favorite flowers, the ones he'd brought me on our first date 15 years ago. The gesture was so perfectly him, so thoughtfully manipulative, that I had to fight to keep my expression neutral. "How was your day?" he asked, sitting beside me and stroking my hair. "Did you remember to eat lunch?" "I think so," I mumbled. "I can't remember. The morning feels fuzzy." "That's okay," he said, kissing my temple. "Dr. Martinez says the medication can affect short-term memory while it's working on the deeper issues. You're getting better, even if it doesn't feel that way." The lies came so easily to him, delivered with such apparent sincerity. I wondered how long he'd been capable of this level of deception. Had he always been a sociopath? Or was this something he'd developed over time? How many other people had he manipulated without me noticing? "Richard," I said carefully, "I've been thinking about my sister. I miss talking to Jennifer. Can I call her tonight?" His hand paused in my hair for just a moment, so briefly that I might not have noticed it before my mind cleared. "Of course, sweetheart. But remember what happened last time you tried to call her? You got confused halfway through the conversation and started crying. It upset you for hours." "I don't remember that," I said truthfully. "When was that?" "Last month." He lied smoothly. "You called her on a Wednesday evening, I think it was. You started telling her about Mom's birthday party, but then you couldn't remember if Mom was still alive or not. Jennifer got worried and wanted to drive over here immediately. You were so agitated that Dr. Martinez had to prescribe a stronger sedative. None of this had happened. There was no phone call, no confusion about my mother, who had died 5 years ago in a car accident that I remembered perfectly clearly. No additional medication. But Richard delivered these fictional details with the same concerned, loving expression he'd worn while actually drugging me for 8 months. "Maybe you're right," I said, slumping against the couch cushions. "I don't want to worry her. She has enough problems of her own." "Exactly," Richard said, relief evident in his voice. "Jennifer loves you, but seeing you like this is hard for her. It's better to protect her from the day-to-day reality while you're recovering." He was so good at this. so practiced at turning love into a weapon. He'd convinced my sister that staying away was the loving thing to do. He'd convinced me that my own mind was failing. He'd convinced doctors, friends, colleagues that he was a devoted husband caring for his sick wife. I wondered how many people he'd fooled, how many had looked at us and thought, what a good man, standing by his wife through such a difficult illness. Richard, I said, letting my voice waver as if I was fighting back tears, what if I don't get better? What if the medication doesn't work and I just keep getting worse? He pulled me against his chest, his arms wrapping around me in what should have been a comforting embrace. Don't think like that, he said. Dr. Martinez is optimistic about your progress. These things take time. But what if? I pressed. What if I become one of those people who can't take care of themselves? What would happen to me then? I felt his body tense slightly, and when he spoke, there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Excitement, maybe, or anticipation poorly disguised as reluctance. Sarah, we don't need to think about that now. You're going to get better. I know, but I worry about it, I said, playing the part of the confused, frightened wife. If I got really bad, would you put me in one of those homes? Would I lose the house? Would you have to divorce me to protect yourself financially? The silence that followed was the longest 10 seconds of my life. I could practically hear the wheels turning in Richard's head as he calculated how much truth to reveal to someone he believed was too medicated to remember or understand complex information. Sweetheart, he said finally, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he used when he thought I was being particularly confused. Let's not worry about things that aren't going to happen. But if you ever did become unable to care for yourself, there are legal protections in place. I would never abandon you, but I might have to make some difficult decisions to ensure you get the best care possible. What kind of decisions? I asked. Well, he said, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. Sometimes when someone is very sick, their family has to take control of their finances and medical decisions. It's called conservatorship or guardianship. It's not divorce exactly, but it does involve legal proceedings to protect the sick person from making decisions that could hurt them. The clinical way he described destroying my autonomy made my stomach turn. He was explaining how he planned to steal my life as if he was discussing the weather. Would that mean you'd get to decide where I live? I asked. Only if it was necessary for your care, he said. If you needed specialized treatment that couldn't be provided at home. But Sarah, this is all hypothetical. You're responding well to treatment. But the house, I persisted. If I had to go somewhere for treatment and it was expensive, would you have to sell the house? Another pause, longer this time. When Richard spoke again, there was something almost eager in his voice, as if he'd been waiting for me to ask this exact question. The house is in both our names, he said. If you were unable to make decisions about your own care, someone would have to manage your assets to pay for treatment. Specialized memory care facilities can cost thousands of dollars a month. The house might have to be sold to cover those expenses, but that would only be if there was no other choice. He was describing how he planned to steal my house, my business partnership, my savings, everything I'd worked for, and he was doing it in the gentle, patient tone of a husband explaining difficult medical realities to his sick wife. But I needed him to go further. I needed him to admit that he was causing my illness, not treating it. Richard, I said, sitting up and looking at him with the most pathetic expression I could manage. I'm scared that I'm not getting better fast enough. Maybe I need different medication or a higher dose. Could you ask Dr. Martinez if there's something stronger I could take? Something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. Dr. Martinez is already monitoring your medication very carefully, he said. Too much too fast could be dangerous. But I feel like I'm getting worse, not better, I said, letting real tears come to my eyes as I thought about everything he'd stolen from me. Some days I can barely remember my own name. Yesterday I couldn't figure out how to use the microwave. What if the medication isn't strong enough? Richard's hand moved to my cheek, wiping away tears with a gentleness that would have been touching if it wasn't so utterly false. Baby, the medication is working exactly as it should be. Your brain chemistry is very delicate right now. Dr. Martinez has calibrated your dosage perfectly for your specific condition. How does he know the right amount? I asked. How does anyone know how much medication someone needs for what I have? It's based on your weight, your symptoms, your response to previous doses, Richard said. Dr. Martinez has been treating patients like you for years. He knows exactly how much medication produces the best results. The way he said results made my blood run cold, not recovery or improvement, results, as if my deteriorating mental state was exactly what Dr. Martinez and Richard had been trying to achieve. "Richard," I said, my voice breaking with real emotion now, "what exactly is wrong with me? What is my condition called? I know you've told me before, but I can't remember." For the first time since he'd come home, Richard hesitated. I watched his face carefully, seeing the moment when he realized he'd never actually given me a diagnosis, because there wasn't one. My illness was the pills he gave me every morning, nothing more. It's complicated," he said finally. "Dr. Martinez calls it stress-induced cognitive impairment with memory consolidation issues. It's not like Alzheimer's or dementia. It's a condition that develops when someone's brain has been under severe stress for extended periods." More lies, delivered with medical-sounding terminology designed to make me stop asking questions. But I wasn't done. "Will I ever get completely better?" I asked. "Will I be able to go back to work? Will I be able to drive again? Will I remember things the way I used to?" The mask slipped. Just for a second, Richard's expression changed to something cold and calculating before snapping back to concerned husband mode. "Sarah, recovery from this type of condition is unpredictable. Some people make significant improvements. Others learn to live with their limitations. The important thing is that you're safe and cared for. By you," I said. "By me," he confirmed, stroking my hair again. "I'll take care of you no matter what happens. Even if you never get completely better, I'll make sure you're safe and comfortable. I promise." The promise of a man who was systematically destroying my mind while positioning himself to inherit everything I'd worked for. The promise of someone who'd isolated me from my family while documenting my decline for insurance purposes. The promise of a predator who'd found the perfect victim in his own wife. Upstairs, I knew Jennifer was recording every word, capturing the evidence we'd need to prove Richard's manipulation. But sitting there beside him, feeling his hands in my hair and hearing his voice making promises about my future that sounded like threats, I felt the full weight of what he'd done to me. This man had spent 8 months watching me forget my own name, watching me struggle to read books I'd loved, watching me cry from frustration when I couldn't remember conversations from the day before. He'd held me when I sobbed about losing my mind, brought me tea when the confusion overwhelmed me, made love to me in our bed while knowing that every kiss, every gentle word, every moment of apparent intimacy was part of an elaborate plan to steal my life. The betrayal was so complete, so thorough, that I felt like I was grieving the death of the man I thought I'd married. Because that man, the one who'd proposed to me on a beach in Maine, who'd held my hand through my father's funeral, who'd celebrated every professional achievement as if it was his own, had never existed. Or maybe he had existed once, but had been replaced by this calculating stranger who could drug his wife while telling her he loved her. I was married to a monster. I'd been sharing my bed with someone who could watch me lose pieces of myself and feel nothing but satisfaction at his plan's success. The Richard I thought I knew would have been horrified by what this Richard was doing to me. But maybe that Richard had been a lie from the beginning. As these realizations crashed over me, I made a decision that would determine whether I survived this or became another cautionary tale about trusting the wrong person. I was going to fight back. I was going to expose him. I was going to make sure he faced consequences for every tear I'd cried, every moment of confusion he'd caused, every piece of my life he'd tried to steal. But first, I needed one more piece of evidence. I needed him to admit that the pills weren't medicine at all. "Richard," I said, leaning against his shoulder like a tired, trusting wife, "I want to get better faster. I hate feeling this way. What if I took 2 pills in the morning instead of 1? Would that help?" His body went completely still. When he spoke, his voice was sharp with something that sounded almost like panic. "Absolutely not," he said. "Sarah, you can never, ever change your medication dosage without Dr. Martinez's approval. Taking more than prescribed could be extremely dangerous. Promise me you won't do that." "Why would it be dangerous?" I asked innocently. "If the medication is helping me, wouldn't more of it help me faster?" "That's not how brain chemistry works," he said, and for the first time, his voice had lost that patient, loving tone. "Sarah, I need you to promise me that you'll only take exactly what I give you, exactly when I give it to you. This is very important." "I promise," I said. "But why are you so worried about it?" "Because," he started, then stopped. seeming to realize he was about to reveal too much. Because people with your condition can have paradoxical reactions to medication. Too much could cause permanent damage instead of helping. Permanent damage. He was worried that I might accidentally take enough of whatever he was giving me to cause permanent damage, which meant he knew exactly what was in those pills, and he knew exactly what they were doing to my brain. What kind of permanent damage? I asked. Sarah, you're asking too many questions, he said, and now his voice was definitely different, harder, less patient. You need to trust me and Dr. Martinez to manage your care. Questioning everything is a sign that your anxiety is getting worse. Maybe I should call Dr. Martinez about adjusting your evening medication. More medication, of course. When in doubt, drug the wife into submission. But I had what I needed. Between the documents in his office and this recorded conversation, we had enough evidence to prove that Richard was deliberately keeping me in a medicated fog, that he was planning to have me declared incompetent, and that he was lying to me about my condition while positioning himself to inherit my assets. The next part of this story will show you exactly how we brought Richard's house of lies crashing down. But you're going to want to subscribe first, because the justice we served was sweeter than anything I could have imagined in my darkest moments. That night, I lay beside my husband pretending to sleep while my mind raced through everything I'd learned. Richard's breathing had settled into the deep, regular rhythm of someone sleeping peacefully, unburdened by guilt or conscience. I wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, to make him look me in the eyes while I told him exactly what I'd discovered. But revenge, I was learning, required patience. Jennifer had left through the back door after Richard fell asleep, taking with her a recording that would change everything. But before she left, we'd made a plan for the morning, a plan that would finally give us the evidence we needed to destroy Richard completely. The next morning followed our usual routine. Richard brought me my pill and orange juice, watched me pretend to swallow it, and left for work with his customary kiss on the forehead. But this time, Jennifer was waiting 2 blocks away in her car, and the moment Richard's BMW disappeared around the corner, she was at my front door. Phase 2, she said grimly, pulling on latex gloves she'd brought from her law office. Let's see what your loving husband has been feeding you. The pill I'd hidden the day before went into a sealed evidence bag. Jennifer had contacted a lab technician through her work who could run an analysis off the books, but we needed more than one sample to establish a pattern. So I retrieved the tissue containing yesterday's medication and carefully scraped the residue into a second bag. What do you think it is? I asked as we packaged everything for testing. Nothing good, Jennifer said. Given your symptoms, I'd guess something in the benzodiazepine family. Maybe Ativan or Xanax in high doses, possibly mixed with something else. Drugs that would cause memory loss, confusion, and dependency without being immediately life-threatening. Whatever it is, it's something that would show up as legitimate medication if anyone tested your blood, but in quantities that would explain your cognitive problems. The thought that Richard had been calculating dosages, monitoring my reactions, adjusting the amount of poison he gave me each day like some sort of pharmaceutical sociopath, made me feel sick. But it also made me angry enough to see this through to the end. While we waited for the lab results, Jennifer helped me gather more evidence. We printed every document from Richard's files, photographed every note, copied every email. We created multiple backup copies and stored them in different locations. If something happened to me before we could expose Richard, Jennifer would have everything she needed to prove what he'd been doing. But the most important evidence came from an unexpected source. Jennifer had insisted on calling Dr. Luis Martinez's office to request copies of my medical records, something that, as my sister, she had every right to do with my written permission. What we discovered was that Dr. Martinez was far more central to this conspiracy than even I had realized. The medical records Jennifer received were a work of fiction. According to Dr. Martinez's notes, I'd been suffering from severe cognitive decline for over a year before Richard brought me in for treatment. The notes described symptoms I'd never experienced, mentioned conversations that had never happened, and detailed a progression of mental deterioration that supposedly began long before I started taking those white pills. But the dates were wrong. Dr. Martinez's records showed me exhibiting severe memory loss in February of last year, a time when I was working on the Morrison project, managing a team of 12 architects, and functioning at the top of my professional game. I had email records, work evaluations, and witnesses who could testify that I was mentally sharp and fully competent during the entire period when Dr. Martinez claimed I was already severely impaired. He's been creating a false medical history, Jennifer said, spreading the fabricated records across my kitchen table. This isn't just malpractice. This is criminal conspiracy. He and Richard have been building a legal case to have you declared incompetent, and they needed medical documentation that predated your actual symptoms. The scope of their planning was breathtaking. Richard and Dr. Martinez had spent months creating a fictional narrative of my mental decline, complete with medical records, insurance claims, and documented proof of my supposed incapacity. When the time came to petition for guardianship, Richard would have a year's worth of professional medical documentation supporting his claim that I was unable to make decisions about my own life. But their elaborate plan had one fatal flaw. They'd been so focused on documenting my decline that they'd never considered the possibility that I might stop taking their medication. The lab results came back 3 days later, and what Jennifer's contact found in those pills was worse than we'd imagined. "It's a combination," Jennifer said, reading from the technician's report. "Flunitrazepam, that's Rohypnol, the date rape drug, mixed with alprazolam, which is Xanax, and something called scopolamine." Scopolamine, I repeated, the word sounding vaguely familiar. "It's sometimes called devil's breath," Jennifer said, her voice tight with anger. "It's used in South America by criminals to make victims compliant and unable to form memories. It makes people extremely susceptible to suggestion while causing severe memory problems. Sarah, he's been giving you a combination of drugs designed to make you forget everything while making you completely controllable." The room spun around me as the full implications hit. Richard hadn't just been making me sick, he'd been using drugs known for criminal purposes to make me into a living puppet. Every time I'd trusted his version of events over my own confusion, every time I'd accepted his explanations for things I couldn't remember, every time I'd let him make decisions for me because I felt too confused to think clearly, I'd been under the influence of substances used by kidnappers and rapists. "How long would someone have to take this combination to show permanent effects?" I asked. Jennifer checked the report again. "According to this, prolonged use can cause lasting damage to memory formation and cognitive function, but the effects should be mostly reversible if someone stops taking it soon enough." She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Sarah, you stopped just in time. A few more months of this, and the damage might have been permanent." That's when I understood the true timeline of Richard's plan. He hadn't been trying to keep me in a medicated fog forever. He'd been planning to cause permanent brain damage that would make his guardianship legitimate. Once my cognitive impairment became irreversible, he could stop the drugs and present himself as the devoted husband caring for his permanently disabled wife. No one would question his control over my assets or his decisions about my care, because I really would be incompetent by then. He'd been planning to destroy my mind completely. The rage that filled me then was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This wasn't just betrayal or even attempted murder. It was an elaborate plan to steal my identity, my autonomy, my very self, while making me complicit in my own destruction. Richard wanted to erase who I was while keeping my body alive as a shell he could control. But Richard had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated my sister's love and persistence. Even when he'd convinced her to stay away, even when he'd made her feel guilty for wanting to help me, Jennifer had never stopped fighting for me. She'd been researching treatment options, looking into legal protections, and gathering resources to help me even when she thought I was genuinely sick. Her love had been the one thing Richard couldn't manipulate or control, and now that love was going to destroy him. The plan Jennifer and I developed was simple but comprehensive. We would gather enough evidence to file both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit. But first, we needed to ensure that Richard couldn't hurt me or anyone else while we built our case. Jennifer contacted the district attorney's office through her legal connections and arranged a meeting with a prosecutor who specialized in domestic violence and elder abuse cases. Even though I wasn't elderly, the tactics Richard had used, isolation, medication manipulation, financial control, followed patterns that prosecutors recognized from cases involving vulnerable adults. We also reached out to the state medical board to file a complaint against Dr. Martinez. His participation in this scheme meant he'd violated every ethical principle of medical practice, and we had documentation proving his involvement. But the most important step was setting a trap that would give us irrefutable evidence of Richard's guilt. The plan required me to continue pretending to take my medication for several more days while we prepared. Jennifer would hide in the house again, this time with a police detective who specialized in domestic violence cases. We would record Richard not just talking about his plans, but actively trying to drug me. Detective Maria Santos was a small woman with intelligent eyes and a reputation for building airtight cases against abusers. When Jennifer explained our situation, Detective Santos had immediately understood the complexity of what we were dealing with. This type of systematic psychological and pharmaceutical abuse is more common than people think, she told us during our planning meeting. Usually we see it in cases where someone is trying to gain control over an elderly parent's estate, but spousal cases happen too. The combination of drugs your husband was giving you is particularly insidious because it would make you completely unable to trust your own perceptions while making you dependent on his version of reality. Detective Santos arranged for recording equipment that would capture both audio and video of Richard's actions. She also coordinated with a doctor who could testify about the effects of the drug combination, and a pharmacologist who could explain how the substances would interact in my system. But the most important element of our trap was something Richard would never see coming: his own arrogance. For 8 months, Richard had been operating under the assumption that I was too drugged to think clearly, too confused to remember details, and too isolated to get help. He'd become comfortable with his routine, confident in his control, and careless about hiding his true intentions. That overconfidence was about to become his downfall. On the day we'd chosen to spring our trap, I played my role perfectly. I took the pill Richard gave me, slipping it under my tongue while he watched. I acted confused and compliant as he left for work. I spent the day in my usual fog of pretended incompetence. But when Richard came home that evening, he found me sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread in front of me, papers I'd taken from his office files. "Sarah," he said, his voice cautious as he noticed the documents. "What are you looking at, sweetheart?" "I found these," I said, my voice shaking with real emotion, but for reasons he couldn't guess. "In your office. I was looking for stamps to mail Jennifer a birthday card, and I found all these papers about me." Richard's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, then forced calm. "Oh, honey, you shouldn't be looking at medical documents. They're too confusing. Let me put these away." He reached for the papers, but I pulled them back. "Richard, what does petition for divorce on grounds of mental incapacity mean?" I watched him realize that his carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. For just a moment, his mask slipped completely, and I saw something cold and predatory in his eyes before he caught himself. "Sarah, you're not thinking clearly," he said, sitting down beside me with exaggerated calm. "Those are hypothetical documents. I asked a lawyer to explain what legal protections might be available if your condition got worse. It doesn't mean anything. But it has our address on it," I said, "and it's dated last week. And it says here that you want to sell our house." "Sweetheart, you're getting confused again," Richard said, reaching for my hands. "This is exactly why Dr. Martinez says you shouldn't try to read complicated documents. They upset you and make your symptoms worse." But I wasn't done. Hidden throughout the house, Detective Santos and Jennifer were recording every word as I continued to press Richard for explanations he couldn't give without revealing his true intentions. "Richard, I'm scared," I said, letting tears come to my eyes. "These papers make it sound like you think I'm never going to get better. They make it sound like you're planning to get rid of me." "Never," he said, pulling me against his chest in what should have been a comforting embrace. "I would never get rid of you. But Sarah, if you got so sick that you couldn't take care of yourself anymore, someone would have to make medical and financial decisions for you. That's what these documents are about, making sure I can protect you if that day ever comes." "But I don't want to be sick anymore," I said, my voice breaking. "I want to get better. I want my life back. What if I stop taking the medication Dr. Martinez prescribed? What if we tried a different doctor?" The change in Richard's demeanor was immediate and terrifying. His arms tightened around me, and when he spoke, his voice was harder than I'd ever heard it. "You can never stop taking your medication," he said. "Dr. Martinez has been very clear about that. Stopping suddenly could cause permanent brain damage. You could have seizures. You could die." More lies, delivered with an intensity that revealed how important it was to him that I continue taking those pills. "But what if the medication isn't working?" I pressed. "What if it's making me worse instead of better?" Richard pulled back to look at me, and for the first time in our marriage, I felt afraid of my own husband. There was something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Desperation, maybe, or panic at the thought that his control might be slipping. "Sarah, The medication is working exactly as it should, he said, gripping my shoulders tightly enough to hurt. Your brain chemistry is very delicate right now. Dr. Martinez has calibrated your treatment perfectly. If you stop taking it, or if you change the dosage, you could become violent or psychotic. You could hurt yourself or someone else. He was describing what would happen if I stopped taking medication I actually needed, not what would happen if I stopped taking the drugs he'd been using to control me. But the desperation in his voice told me everything I needed to know about how crucial it was to his plan that I remain medicated. I just want to feel like myself again, I said, playing the part of the confused, frightened wife. I want to remember things. I want to be able to work again. I want to call my sister without forgetting what we talked about. I know, Richard said, stroking my hair with hands that were trembling slightly. But you have to trust me. You have to trust Dr. Martinez. We're the only ones who understand your condition. We're the only ones who can help you. The possessiveness in his voice made my skin crawl. He wasn't talking about helping me. He was talking about owning me. That's when I played my final card. Richard, I said, looking up at him with wide, trusting eyes. If something happened to you, who would take care of me? Who would make sure I took my medication the right way? His face lit up with something that looked almost like relief. This was exactly the kind of question a dependent, confused wife would ask. The kind of question that confirmed his control was absolute. Don't worry about that, he said. I've made arrangements. Dr. Martinez knows exactly what medication you need and how much. If anything happened to me, he would make sure you were properly cared for. But where would I live? There are excellent facilities for people with your condition, Richard said. Places where trained professionals can make sure you take your medication consistently and manage all the details of daily life that have become too complicated for you. He was describing my future in a psychiatric facility, medicated into compliance, while he managed my assets as my legal guardian. The picture he painted was of a woman who would live out her days in a fog of chemical dependency, while her husband controlled her money and made decisions about every aspect of her care. But he'd also just confessed on tape that he'd made arrangements for my long-term institutionalization while maintaining control over my medical treatment. Would you visit me? I asked. Of course, he said. I'd visit you all the time. I'd make sure you had everything you needed. You'd be safe and comfortable, and the medical staff would manage your condition so you wouldn't have to worry about anything ever again. The casual way he described condemning me to a life of chemical dependency and institutional confinement was the final piece of evidence we needed. Richard wasn't just planning to steal my money. He was planning to steal my entire existence while positioning himself as the devoted husband who sacrificed everything to care for his sick wife. That night, after Richard fell asleep beside me, Detective Santos and Jennifer emerged from their hiding places with recordings that would change everything. We have enough, Detective Santos said quietly. Between the documents, the drug analysis, and tonight's conversation, we can file charges for attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, and domestic violence. Dr. Martinez will be charged as a co-conspirator. The next morning, while Richard was in the shower preparing for another day of his double life, police officers surrounded our house. I was sitting in the kitchen, pretending to take my morning medication, when the doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see Detective Santos standing on our front porch with 3 uniformed officers. Sarah? Richard called from upstairs. Are you expecting someone? I don't think so, I called back, my voice shaking with genuine emotion. Not confusion or fear this time, but anticipation. Richard came downstairs in his bathrobe, his hair still wet from the shower, and opened the front door to find Detective Santos holding a warrant for his arrest. Richard Campbell, she said, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, and domestic violence. I will never forget the expression on Richard's face in that moment. Confusion, then disbelief, then a desperate look toward me as if I might somehow explain what was happening. Sarah, he said, his voice cracking. Sarah, what's going on? Tell them there's been a mistake. I stood up from the kitchen table, still holding the morning pill he'd given me, and looked him in the eyes as I spoke the words I'd been practicing in my head for days. There's no mistake, Richard. I know what you've been doing to me. I know about the drugs, about Dr. Martinez, about your plans to have me declared incompetent. I know about everything. I opened my hand and showed him the white pill I'd never swallowed. I stopped taking your medication 5 days ago. My mind is perfectly clear now. Clear enough to remember everything you've done to me, and clear enough to make sure you face consequences for it. The transformation in Richard's face was complete. The mask of the loving, concerned husband fell away entirely, replaced by something ugly and desperate. "You don't understand," he said, as the officers moved to handcuff him. "I was trying to help you. Everything I did was for your own good. You were falling apart, Sarah. You couldn't handle your own life anymore." Even as he was being arrested, even with overwhelming evidence of his crimes, Richard was still trying to gaslight me into believing that I was sick and he was my savior. But I was done believing his lies. "The only thing that was making me fall apart was what you were feeding me every morning," I said, my voice steady and strong. "I'm not sick, Richard. I never was. The only thing wrong with me was trusting you." As they led him away, Richard tried one last manipulation. He looked back at me with tears in his eyes and said, "Sarah, please, I love you. Everything I did was because I love you. But love doesn't drug someone into confusion for 8 months. Love doesn't document someone's decline for insurance purposes. Love doesn't plan to steal someone's identity while convincing them they're going insane." What Richard felt for me wasn't love. It was ownership, and the difference between the two had nearly cost me everything I was. I need you to subscribe to see the final part of this story, because what happened to Richard and Dr. Martinez in court will show you that justice is possible, even when the people who hurt us try to use our love against us. The legal proceedings that followed Richard's arrest unfolded like a masterclass in how psychological manipulation can be systematically dismantled by evidence and truth. But the road to justice was longer and more complicated than I'd anticipated, partly because Richard and Dr. Martinez had been so thorough in their documentation of my supposed mental illness. Richard's defense attorney, a slick corporate lawyer named Marcus Webb, initially tried to argue that I was genuinely mentally ill and that Richard had been acting out of love and concern. Webb painted Richard as a devoted husband who had been driven to desperate measures by his wife's deteriorating condition, suggesting that any irregularities in my treatment were the result of misguided love rather than criminal intent. My client was watching the woman he loved disappear before his eyes, Webb argued during the preliminary hearings. Mrs. Campbell's own medical records show a pattern of severe cognitive decline dating back over a year. Mr. Campbell's actions, while perhaps not conventional, were those of a man trying to save his wife's life. But Jennifer and our legal team, led by prosecutor Amanda Chen, were ready for this defense. The key breakthrough came when we discovered that Dr. Martinez had been running a broader scheme involving at least 6 other patients. Detective Santos had followed the money trail from Richard's payments to Dr. Martinez and uncovered a network of falsified medical records, forged prescriptions, and coordinated guardianship petitions. Dr. Martinez, it turned out, had developed a business model around creating mentally incompetent patients whose assets could be controlled by their concerned family members. He provided the medical documentation, prescribed the drugs that would cause cognitive impairment, and testified in court about his patients' need for guardianship, all in exchange for significant fees and percentages of the controlled estates. When police raided Dr. Martinez's office, they found detailed files on dozens of patients, including dosage calculations, behavioral modification schedules, and timeline projections for achieving optimal compliance levels. The paperwork read like a pharmaceutical cookbook for creating controllable victims. The other victims ranged in age from 38 to 74. Some were wealthy elderly individuals whose adult children wanted early access to their inheritance. Others were spouses in divorce situations where one partner wanted to avoid equitable asset division. All of them had been systematically drugged into confusion while their families positioned themselves as caring guardians. When these other cases came to light, Richard's defense strategy collapsed entirely. It became impossible to argue that he was acting out of misguided love when the evidence showed he was participating in a criminal enterprise designed to steal assets from vulnerable people. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and every day brought new revelations about the scope of Richard and Dr. Martinez's operation. Testimony from the other victims and their families painted a picture of a sophisticated conspiracy that had been operating for at least 4 years. But the most powerful moment came when I testified about what Richard had put me through. I took the stand on a Tuesday morning in November, almost exactly a year after Richard had first brought me to see Dr. Martinez. Sitting in that courtroom, looking at my husband in his orange jumpsuit, I felt a clarity and strength that had been missing from my life for so long. Prosecutor Chen walked me through the timeline of my deterioration, the systematic isolation from my family and friends, the documented evidence of Richard's planning, and the effects of the drugs I'd been given. But when she asked me to describe how it felt to discover that the person I'd trusted most in the world had been deliberately destroying my mind, I found words I hadn't known I possessed. "Richard didn't just try to steal my money," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "He tried to steal my identity. He wanted to erase who I was while keeping my body alive as something he could control. He watched me cry from frustration when I couldn't remember simple words, and he comforted me while knowing that he was the cause of my confusion. He held me when I was terrified about losing my mind, while he was actively making that terror a reality." I looked directly at Richard as I continued. But the worst part wasn't the drugs or the lies or even the financial planning. The worst part was that he made me complicit in my own destruction. He used my love for him as a weapon against me. Every time I trusted his version of events over my own confused memories, every time I let him make decisions for me because I felt too scattered to think clearly, I was helping him steal my life. Richard's attorney tried to challenge my testimony, suggesting that my memories might still be affected by the drugs I'd taken or by trauma from my illness. But Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the neurologist who had examined me after my arrest, was ready with expert testimony about my cognitive function. "Mrs. Campbell shows no signs of lasting damage from the substances she was given," Dr. Mitchell testified. "Her memory, reasoning ability, and cognitive function are all within normal ranges for someone her age and education level. The confusion and memory problems she experienced were directly caused by the combination of drugs she was being given, and those effects have completely resolved since she stopped taking them." The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Richard was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, domestic violence, and elder abuse. The elder abuse charges stuck because the prosecution successfully argued that Richard's actions constituted abuse of a vulnerable adult, regardless of my age. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for 8 years. Dr. Martinez received an even harsher sentence, 22 years, due to the number of victims involved and his abuse of his medical license. His medical practice was permanently revoked, and he was ordered to pay restitution to all of his victims. But the criminal convictions were only the beginning of the justice process. The civil lawsuit that followed allowed me to recover not only my own assets, but also damages for the psychological trauma Richard had inflicted. The court awarded me $3, $2 million in punitive damages, plus full control of all marital assets and properties. Richard's pension, savings, and inheritance from his parents all became part of the settlement. More importantly, the publicity surrounding the case led to legislative changes in how guardianship proceedings are monitored and how medical professionals are regulated. Sarah's Law, as the media dubbed it, now requires multiple independent medical evaluations before anyone can be declared mentally incompetent, and creates criminal penalties for medical professionals who falsify patient records for financial gain. The other victims of Richard and Dr. Martinez's scheme also found justice. Guardianships that had been granted based on falsified medical records were reversed. Assets that had been stolen were returned. Family members who had been isolated from their loved ones were reunited. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was personal rather than legal. 6 months after Richard's sentencing, I stood in my architectural office, the same office I'd thought I'd lost forever, holding the blueprints for a new project. My partnership at Wellington & Associates had been restored with full seniority and back pay. My reputation in the industry, once I could explain what had happened to me, was stronger than ever. Margaret Wellington had become one of my fiercest advocates, helping to spread awareness about the type of psychological manipulation I'd endured and supporting other women who found themselves in similar situations. "You know," she said one afternoon, as we reviewed plans for a new community center, "what Richard did to you was evil. But your survival and recovery have helped more people than you probably realize. The strength it took to fight back against that level of manipulation, not everyone could have done what you did, but I didn't feel particularly strong most days." Recovery from psychological trauma doesn't follow a straight line, and there were still moments when I questioned my own memories, still times when I felt a flash of confusion and wondered if it was real or just an echo of the medication I'd been given. Therapy helped. Dr. Rebecca Torres, a psychologist who specialized in trauma from domestic violence, helped me understand that doubting my own perceptions was a normal response to what Richard had done to me. Gaslighting, she explained, creates lasting effects even after the gaslighting stops. Your husband spent 8 months systematically undermining your ability to trust your own mind, Dr. Torres told me during one of our sessions. He used pharmaceutical manipulation combined with psychological manipulation to make you dependent on his version of reality. Recovery means learning to trust yourself again, and that takes time. The hardest part of recovery was rebuilding relationships that Richard had damaged through his manipulation. My sister Jennifer and I had to work through the guilt she felt about staying away during my illness, even though I assured her repeatedly that she'd been manipulated just as thoroughly as I had. I should have insisted on seeing you, she said during one of our long talks. I should have known something was wrong when Richard kept making excuses. He convinced you that staying away was the loving thing to do, I reminded her. That's what manipulators do. They turn our love into a weapon against us. But you never really abandoned me. When I needed you most, you were there. Some relationships couldn't be repaired. Friends who had believed Richard's version of my illness and stopped reaching out felt too uncomfortable to resume contact once they learned the truth. A few colleagues at work seemed unable to separate me from the confused, incompetent woman they remembered from my final months at the firm. But new relationships blossomed from the wreckage of my old life. I connected with other survivors of psychological abuse, forming friendships based on understanding that I'd never experienced before. I began speaking at conferences about domestic violence, helping to educate people about the subtle forms that abuse can take. I learned that what Richard had done to me was more common than most people realize. Pharmaceutical abuse, using medication to control or manipulate someone, happens frequently in situations involving elderly parents, disabled adults, and vulnerable spouses. The combination of drugs Richard had given me was particularly insidious, but variations of his tactics were being used by abusers across the country. The speaking engagements led to consulting work with law enforcement agencies, helping to train officers to recognize signs of medication-based abuse. I worked with legislators to strengthen protections for vulnerable adults and collaborated with medical boards to improve oversight of physicians who work with patients suffering from cognitive issues. 2 years after Richard's arrest, I received a letter from him in prison. My first instinct was to throw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as an apology. Richard wrote about his regret, his love for me, his belief that he'd been trying to help me even though his methods were wrong. He described his life in prison, implied that his punishment was excessive given his good intentions, and suggested that we might rebuild our marriage after his release if I could find it in my heart to forgive him. Even from prison, even after being convicted of systematically trying to destroy my mind, Richard was still trying to control the narrative. He was still trying to make me believe that his abuse had been love. I wrote back exactly one sentence: I forgive you, but I will never forget what you did to me. Then I donated his letter to my attorney's files as evidence of his continued attempts at manipulation. Forgiveness, I'd learned, didn't mean reconciliation. It didn't mean pretending that what he'd done was acceptable or understandable. It meant releasing the hold that his actions had on my future. It meant refusing to let him continue poisoning my life from behind bars. 3 years after the trial ended, I met David Chen, no relation to the prosecutor who had helped convict Richard. David was a structural engineer who had lost his wife to genuine early-onset dementia, and he understood both the grief of watching someone you love lose their memories and the particular horror of discovering that such a loss could be artificially induced. Our relationship developed slowly, built on honesty and transparency that I'd never experienced in my marriage to Richard. David knew my history from the beginning, understood my trust issues, and was patient with the ways that trauma had changed how I approached intimacy and commitment. We married on a beach in Maine, the same beach where Richard had proposed to me 15 years earlier. But this time, the promises we made were different. We promised to be honest with each other, even when the truth was difficult. We promised to support each other's independence rather than trying to control each other's choices. We promised that love would never be used as a weapon between us. Today, 5 years after I hid that pill under my tongue and discovered what my husband did when he thought I'd forgotten, I live in a restored Victorian house that David and I designed together. My architectural practice specializes in creating spaces for women's shelters and facilities for abuse survivors, buildings designed to feel safe and empowering rather than institutional. I never see Richard, though I receive occasional updates about his life in prison through the Victim Services Coordinator. He's apparently become a model prisoner, participating in therapy programs and anger management classes. He's scheduled for his first parole hearing in 3 years, and when that time comes, I'll be there to testify about the lasting effects of what he did to me. But I don't spend much time thinking about Richard anymore. The woman who married him, the woman who trusted him completely, who never questioned his motives, who believed that love meant never having to doubt your partner's intentions, that woman died somewhere in the fog of those white pills. The woman who emerged from that pharmaceutical haze was someone stronger, more careful, more aware of how easily trust can be weaponized. I learned that the most dangerous predators aren't strangers lurking in dark alleys. They're the people who share our beds, who hold us when we cry, who promise to love and protect us while systematically destroying us from within. They're the ones who know exactly how to use our love against us because they've been studying us for years, learning our vulnerabilities and our blind spots. But I also learned that survival is possible, even when the person trying to destroy you is the one you trust most. Recovery is possible, even from betrayals that cut to the bone of who you are. Justice is possible, even when the system seems designed to protect abusers who are clever enough to hide their crimes behind masks of love and concern. If you're reading this story and something about it feels familiar, if you've been struggling with confusion that doesn't make sense, if someone in your life has become overly controlling while claiming it's for your own good, if you've found yourself doubting your own perceptions while someone else insists they know what's best for you, please trust your instincts. Please reach out for help. Please remember that love doesn't require you to surrender your agency or your ability to think for yourself. The pills Richard gave me were designed to steal my memories, but the memory that remains strongest from that entire experience is the moment I decided to hide one under my tongue. That decision, that single act of defiance against someone who thought he owned my mind, changed everything. Sometimes the smallest acts of rebellion against those who would control us become the foundation for reclaiming our entire lives. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is refuse to swallow what we're being fed and insist on seeing the truth for ourselves. Richard smiled when he watched me take that pill because he thought my compliance meant his victory was complete, but he was wrong. My compliance had been chemically induced, and the moment I stopped taking his medication, his power over me began to crumble. He thought he was watching me forget. Instead, he was watching me remember who I used to be and discover who I was strong enough to become. The memory pill was supposed to make me forget everything. Instead, it taught me that some things are too important to ever forget. The sound of my own voice when I speak the truth, the feeling of my own mind when it's clear and strong, and the knowledge that no one, no matter how much they claim to love me, has the right to decide who I should be. That's a memory worth fighting for. That's a memory worth everything. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe and share it with others who might need to hear it. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is help each other remember that we're stronger than the people who try to break us, and that justice is possible even when the odds seem impossible. Your subscription helps me continue sharing stories that matter, stories that can help people recognize when they're being manipulated and find the strength to fight back. Remember, you are not crazy. You are not too sensitive. You know the difference between love and control. Trust yourself.